Welcome back to Mornings with Zerlina. Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan represents Virginia's 4th District and is back with us. Good morning, Congresswoman. Thank you so much for being with us.
Good morning, and thank you.
There's a lot of news in the state of Virginia because one of the first moves the Trump administration did this week is taking away protections for DEI and furloughing and preparing to lay off federal workers who work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Talk a bit about the impact on your constituents and the constituents who live in Virginia and Maryland.
Well, it goes even farther than that, because one of the things his EO did was rescind the equal employment opportunity executive order that President Johnson signed in 1965, which also extended non-discriminatory practices to employees of U.S. government contractors. So when you combine the over 200,000 federal employees and contractors that live in Virginia, in the name of ending wokeness, what the president has done is said you can be fired for anything, really. And it's very concerning. Even if you look at the purpose of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, they were designed to recognize the fact the federal government workforce should reflect the diversity of the people that it serves. That the Civil Rights Act was not a magic wand that erased 300 years of the impact of slavery and Jim Crow, and that we had to ensure that the federal workforce made all of our employees feel welcome so that we could attract the best and the brightest. And President Trump has now turned all of that on its head, made it more difficult for us to meet the needs of the American people. And when you combine that with the general hiring freeze, now in my district, our VA hospital had a meeting yesterday concerned about the fact they now have to rescind job offers that they have given to employees to meet the needs of our veterans, the healthcare needs of our veterans. They cannot now open a new VA hospital in Fredericksburg because of a hiring freeze. And we already aren't meeting the needs of our veterans. So that's one concrete example of how these broad orders are impacting people, but they're going to roll back over 60 years, if not 150 years, of civil rights progress to protect people from discrimination based on who they are.
It's so frustrating to see some of these early moves take place, not because we were surprised, not because we didn't know that would happen, but because so many Americans out there voted and said, I'm voting for Donald Trump because of the cost of living and because my eggs are too expensive. And it feels to me like it didn't penetrate into their consciousness that this is what they wanted to do, right? They already said they're not doing anything about the cost of eggs, right? So they were talking about the cost of eggs being too high without even explaining how they were going to fix that problem. But also, this is some of the rhetoric that they were using during the campaign. And I think people didn't believe that they would do these things.
Well, the president, he straight up lied because he said, I don't know anything about Project 2025. All this was spelled out in Project 2025.
That's right.
He might not have known, but he signed it. He did not know that in his pardons, and he admitted this when asked by a reporter, he didn't know that he pardoned someone convicted of brutally attacking a Capitol Police officer. He straight up said, I didn't know. He thought he commuted the sentence. So he and his people told us exactly what they were going to do in Project 2025, and they're doing it.
They are doing it. Some of the other things that are in Project 2025 are potentially a national abortion ban. And you and I have talked repeatedly about the impact of them enforcing the Comstock Act. What are some of the things that you're thinking through? We've talked to several congresspeople this week about some of the moves the Democrats can make in Congress to prevent and mitigate some of the damage that would come from enforcement of the Comstock Act or a national abortion ban. What are some of the things you're thinking about in terms of priorities on that issue?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways we have to approach it because this is an all hands on deck moment, and we are working with our allied partners um, to attack this in the courts because many of these orders, and I think the way they would want to enforce the Comstock Act arguably would be
Hmm.
unconstitutional or against federal law. So where we can, we have got to take this fight to the courts. Um, in Congress, though, they proved they could not govern with a five-person majority in the House, let alone a one-person majority. So House Democrats are going to stand united to protect reproductive freedom, to protect the American people from the worst impulses of this administration. And I now, as the chair of the Abortion Access Task Force of the Reproductive Freedom Caucus, will be focused on first uplifting stories because again, when you look at some of the language used and the title of these EEOs or in their explanation of what they're doing, it sounds fine on its face, but
Hmm.
buried in there, for example, in his EO um, declaring that there are only two genders, a man and a woman, he snuck in personhood
Yep.
because he defined male and female based at conception. So we have got to be vigilant reading them all. We have got to take our time because he is trying to overwhelm us with the fire hose effect. But we need to make sure that we are uplifting stories about how these actions are impacting the people that we represent. And when people see how they're being impacted, they're not going to be happy about it.
I think that's such an important point is make sure you're reading all the language because sometimes Trump hasn't even read it. And he's doing these things because they're placing them on his desk next to the Diet Coke button. He's signing it and he doesn't really even understand the full impact. And that is by design.
Clearly, yes.
One of the questions that I think a lot of folks at home have, and we've talked about this many, many times, not you and I specifically, but we've talked about this on the show many times since the election, is there are some Democrats who are talking about bipartisanship. And I understand that there are some issues that some Democrats think that they can work with Republicans on. How are you thinking about the topic of bipartisanship balancing that with all, like the resistance to some of the most harmful policies?
I think, there are issues where we can find common ground. The devil's in the details. And
Hmm.
I follow the lead of Hakeem Jeffries.
Hmm.
They are going to find out very quickly because they fight amongst themselves that with a one seat majority in the House and they don't have a filibuster proof majority in the Senate, they can't get anything done on a lot of issues without Democrats voting for them. And if they want Democrats to vote for them, they are going to have to work with Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer. And if they want to cut Democrats out of the discussion and completely ignore us and barrel ahead, then they're not going to get anything done. And I think they're going to find that out very quickly.
One of the other questions that I had is how do we engage people who are very disillusioned right now? I think there's so many people who, as we've said, are tired. They're exhausted. We've been through a lot. 2024 was a lot. It was an up and down emotional roller coaster.
Mhm.
And it didn't turn out the way that so many of the folks listening had hoped. But we still have to do our damnedest to protect people who are going to be harmed. So, what is your message? And how are you engaging people who are feeling disillusioned right now?
I think we have to remember that the history of America is progress and backlash, and we
Mhm.
are in the backlash now.
Yeah.
And I'm tired and I'm angry. I am fighting the same fights that my parents, my grandparents, my great grandparents fought. But what keeps me going are two things. I am fighting that fight from a position of more strength and power than they could ever have dreamed of because they
Mhm.
didn't give up. I'm fighting these fights so that my children and my grandchildren don't have to. And feel what you feel, acknowledge that you're tired, but do not give up because if you give up, we are lost. John Lewis said, Democracy is not a state. It is an act that requires every generation to do its part to build the beloved community. If he had given up, if Dr. King had given up, if Shirley Chisholm had given up, we wouldn't have gotten the progress we've gotten. We've got to fight to keep it.
I think that's the perfect message for the folks who are listening at home because I think about that all the time. I think about how I'm only here sitting in front of this microphone able to have this conversation with you, Congresswoman, because the ancestry that I have in my lineage, they didn't give up, right? They
Exactly.
fought fiercer battles and as you said, had less power and they did not give up. And that is why we are here able to fight and continue progress moving forward. Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan, representing Virginia's 4th District, thank you so much for being back with us. Come back anytime and chat.
Thank you.
We're going to take a very quick break and we're going to chat with the Peace Doctor, Erica Ford. That conversation coming up after this break.